Nemesis isn't punishment. She is what happens after you think you got away with it. The myths try to hide what the gods did. Nemesis doesn't. Even the Olympians can't outrun her. So drop the later labels and go back to the scene of the crime. It starts with Zeus. Zeus sees Nemesis and decides he's going to take her. She refuses and runs, because she knows what happens when Zeus doesn't accept an answer. At first she tries to outrun him. When that doesn't work, she changes shape to throw him off, hoping a different body will buy her a clean escape. It buys her seconds, not safety. He stays on her, step for step, like the chase is something he's owed. She makes one last move and turns into a goose, trying to escape into the sky. Zeus follows as a swan, catches her anyway, and the myth doesn't pretend she chose what happens next. After that, the only thing the story can't hide is what gets left behind: an egg. It's found and carried until it reaches Leda, and she ends up holding it like it's her burden to solve, even though it began with someone else's will. When the shell finally breaks, Helen of Troy steps into the world, and the name already feels heavy because it drags ships, kings, and a war behind it. The later storytellers can call it fate if they want. In this version, it starts as the result of a chase, and the consequences keep moving long after the field is empty. The next story drops the thunder and keeps the pattern. Narcissus grows up with people staring at him like he's a promise. He learns to enjoy it, and he learns how to turn it into power, taking the attention and sending the person away. Admiration follows him, and so does the damage, even when he pretends not to notice. Somewhere nearby, someone finally asks for balance, not for comfort and not for revenge, just for the world to stop rewarding the same kind of cruelty. Nemesis answers by leading Narcissus to a quiet place where the air feels still. A pool waits there, smooth enough to look like glass, and he leans over it, expecting to see water. Instead, he sees a face that stops him cold, and he stays because it feels like the first thing in his life that truly belongs to him. It's his own reflection. He reaches for it, and the surface breaks. When he pulls back, the face snaps into focus again, clear enough to pull him in and distant enough to keep him wanting. That's the trap. He stays there, trying to get closer to something that will never become real, and while he's stuck at the edge of the pool, the world keeps moving without him. In the end, Narcissus doesn't get a dramatic punishment. He gets the one thing he can't stand: being ignored by life itself. By the end, he's worn down, and the story leaves him there with nothing. Those are the two Nemesis stories most people know. Keep them in your head, because I'm coming back to both of them later. And that's enough to feel what Nemesis is before anyone tries to soften her. She's the answer that shows up after the line is crossed, and she doesn't need speeches to do it. When people picture her, they don't make her warm. They give her wings, because consequences move fast, and they give her the tools that measure what people try to pretend doesn't matter. Scales show up because actions have weight. A measuring rod shows up because limits exist, even when someone decides to act like they don't. Before we go any further, we need one clean set of labels, because this is where people get mixed up fast. Themis is order. She's the idea that there is a law behind the world, something stable that exists even before a courtroom does. Dike is judgment in motion. She's the act of justice being carried out when someone crosses the line. Tyche is luck. Good or bad, deserved or undeserved, it's the part of life that lands on you without asking who you are. Nemesis is different. She isn't the system. She's the correction that shows up after excess, arrogance, or imbalance, especially when power thinks the rules don't apply. Keep those four names separate. If you blur them into one justice goddess, the rest of the story stops making sense. That separation also matters for the symbols people attach to her. When Nemesis is shown with scales, it's not a courtroom logo. It's weight. In practice, it's the idea that actions count even when nobody wants to count them. A measuring rod says the same thing in the plainest way possible. There's a limit, and it can be checked. The bridle shows up for the same reason, because pride runs wild when nothing holds it back. The wheel belongs in her imagery too, because fortune turns, and the top never stays the top forever. Sometimes you'll see harsher tools too, like a whip or a scourge. Those don't mean she's evil. they mean correction can hurt. This is the older visual vocabulary: measure, restraint, reversal, and enforcement. From here on, we can stop treating these stories like they appeared out of thin air. We can track when Nemesis shows up in the record and who is actually saying what. One of the earliest anchors is Hesiod, writing roughly around 700 before Christ. In Theogony, Nemesis appears in a list of powers linked to night, which matters because it places her in the world as a force, not as a character invented to patch one plot hole. Now, the Zeus and Nemesis chase you just heard, the goose, the swan, the egg, and the chain that leads to Helen, doesn't come to us as one clean, original manuscript that we can point to and close the case. The oldest stream behind it is the early Trojan War tradition tied to the epic cycle, often associated with the Cypria, usually placed broadly in the early Greek period, around the 7th century before Christ or later, even though the poem itself survives only in summaries and references. What matters for us is simple. By the time later writers are compiling myths, this version is already treated like known material. If you want the clearest, step-by-step version in writing, that comes later. A major handbook source is Apollodorus, often dated to around the 1st or 2nd century after Christ. In his account, the sequence is explicit. Nemesis flees, Zeus takes the swan form, the egg is produced, it ends up with Leda, and Helen enters the story from there. Then there's Pausanias, also writing in the 2nd century after Christ, and he's useful in a different way. He reports what the Greeks say about Helen's parentage in relation to Nemesis, and he also gives a detail that warns us not to trust later artwork too quickly. He describes an ancient statue of Nemesis at Rhamnus, and notes that the winged look is not necessarily original. That's a big rule for this episode going forward. Stories can stay steady while images drift. And this is where Nemesis stops being only a story and becomes something you can point to. At Rhamnus in Attica, Nemesis isn't just a name in a poem. She's a cult with a real site, a real sanctuary, and real dedications. People left inscriptions. They paid for offerings too, and the idea was concrete enough to build around. You also start seeing the way epithets shape public memory. Rhamnusia ties her directly to that place. Adrasteia shows up as a name linked to the same corrective logic, and later writers sometimes treat it as a title, sometimes as a separate figure, and sometimes as another face of Nemesis. The takeaway isn't that the ancients had one neat chart. That takeaway is that Nemesis had local gravity. She wasn't theoretical. So when we talk about public imagination, this is the earliest kind. Not fandom, not metaphor, but worship and civic presence. Now jump to the other myth you already heard, Narcissus. The best-known full version is Ovid in Metamorphoses, published around 8 years after Christ. In Ovid's telling, Nemesis is named directly as the one who answers the prayer that Narcissus should desire and never be able to possess what he desires. That doesn't prove Ovid invented Nemesis's role, but it does prove this link is fully formed by the early Roman period, in the text that ends up dominating later retellings. There's one more useful anchor from later antiquity, because it shows Nemesis moving into a clearer public voice. In the 2nd century after Christ, the poet Mesomedes wrote a hymn to Nemesis. It's not a myth scene like Zeus or Narcissus. It's more like a statement of what people thought Nemesis did. She checks excess. She pulls back what rises too far. And she's tied to the idea of measure. That matters because it shows the shift from story to principle happening inside the ancient world itself, long before modern karma talk. So here's the clean timeline, without retelling the scenes you already know. Nemesis appears early as a named power in archaic Greek genealogy through Hesiod. The Helen egg tradition belongs to the old Trojan War stream and is treated as established material by the time later compilers write it down in full sequence. By the Roman era, handbook writers and travelers preserve the chain, while poets like Ovid lock in the Narcissus episode as the version most people inherit. From this point on, we follow one rule. When a detail appears, we ask who says it, how early it is, and what kind of source it comes from: poem, handbook, or local report. Now that we've pinned down where the stories show up in writing, we can separate what's solid from what's shaky, because Nemesis is one of those figures where later retellings love to smooth out the edges. So now we start with what's strong. Nemesis, as a named figure in early Greek tradition, is not a modern invention. Hesiod placing her among the powers tied to night is one of the clearest early anchors. That doesn't tell us everything about her personality, but it does tell us she belongs to the oldest mythic framework, not a late add-on. The Narcissus link is also strong in a specific sense. Ovid gives us a full, readable version where Nemesis is explicitly named as the one who answers the prayer. When people today picture Narcissus at the pool, they're usually seeing Ovid's version, whether they know it or not. That means the Nemesis-Narcissus connection is well attested in a major early Roman text, even if it doesn't prove that every earlier Greek community told it the same way. On the Zeus and egg chain, the timeline already showed the issue. We're dealing with different kinds of sources, not one clean, early, first edition. The core claim here is simple. Zeus pursues Nemesis. She tries to escape through shapeshifting. The aftermath is an egg, and that egg links to Helen. Later compilers like Apollodorus preserve that chain as a straightforward sequence. Pausanias also reports the idea that Nemesis is tied to Helen's origin, which shows it wasn't just a random scribble in one handbook. Some of the oldest Trojan War material is lost, so we can't quote a clean, earliest wording. Pausanias is especially useful here because he quietly breaks the spell that later iconography casts. If an ancient statue at Rhamnus is described without wings, and later art loves to add wings, that tells you something important. Nemesis can be the same force in the story, while the visuals people attach to her can shift depending on the era's taste. So if we reduce it to what we can say cleanly, the ledger looks like this. Nemesis as a primordial corrective force is strongly grounded in early tradition. Nemesis, as the named agent in Narcissus's punishment, is strongly grounded in Ovid's text. Nemesis, as the mother source behind Helen through an egg, is a real tradition preserved by later writers, but the path back to the earliest surviving form is less direct, which lowers our certainty about the oldest version's exact shape, while still leaving the tradition itself standing. That difference matters, because it stops us from doing what modern retellings love to do. They mash everything into one neat, official biography. The older the mythology, the less official it gets. What stays consistent is not one single script, but the function. Nemesis is what follows when someone overreaches, and the world refuses to let the imbalance stand. And next, we're going to test the biggest modern shortcut of all. The way Nemesis gets collapsed into Lady Justice, as if that's what she always was, when the sources suggest something sharper and older. So here's how we're grading claims in this episode. When something shows up in early Greek poetry, that's a strong anchor for the name and the role. If it comes from a Roman poet like Ovid, it's strong for that specific version, and it also explains why later culture remembers it so clearly. A handbook mythographer can still be valuable because it preserves a chain of events, but we don't treat it like the first telling. A traveler like Pausanias is different again because he records what people say and do on the ground, and that's where iconography can surprise you. Finally, if a detail only exists in modern charts and modern posts, we keep it labeled as modern unless an actual primary source turns up. Now we can talk about how Nemesis shifts in public imagination without losing the evidence. By the time Nemesis reaches the modern world, most people aren't meeting her through ancient texts. They're meeting her through images, shortcuts, and the kind of cultural memory that prefers clean symbols over messy sources. That's where the shift happens. We start with the visuals because visuals are where the confusion begins. In the older material, Nemesis reads like a corrective force. The symbols that fit her job are the ones that talk about limits and restraint. You see measuring and rebalancing as the core idea, not courtroom procedure. Wings can appear as a way to say, consequences arrive, and tools of measure show up because the whole concept is about excess being pulled back into line. This is not a judge. It's a boundary being enforced. Later on, the public imagination starts compressing multiple goddesses into one silhouette. A woman with scales becomes a universal sign for justice, even when the historical roots of that image belong more cleanly to Themis, Dike, and Roman Justitia. Once that shorthand takes over, Nemesis gets pulled into it by association. People don't ask which goddess the symbol originally points to, they see scales and assume the rest. That slide gets faster in modern culture, because modern culture rewards instant recognition. The internet loves icons that read in half a second. Scales read as justice, the blindfold reads as fairness, and the sword reads as punishment. Those symbols travel well because they're simple, and simple symbols win in thumbnails, posters, and quick explainer clips. The cost is nuance. Nemesis becomes karma in a single word, or instant justice in a single image, and the older distinctions get flattened until everything becomes one vague idea. Bad people get what they deserve. Then the next shift kicks in, and it's bigger than most people realize. Modern myth-making works like a Wild West. Stories become modular. People cut a part they like, paste it onto another tradition, and call it a genealogy, even when it's really a collage. A name becomes a plug-in, and a symbol becomes a skin. After that, a relationship becomes canon because it got repeated enough times in modern charts and posts. That's where crossover lore is born. It isn't ancient. It's not how the Greeks believed. It's how modern audiences rebuild mythology into a single tidy universe, the way superhero fans want one timeline that explains everything. Here's one clear warning sign, and it shows up a lot. You'll sometimes see modern genealogies claiming Zeus is Nemesis's father. That's a late-stage claim that circulates online because it makes a chart look complete. The problem is obvious the moment you compare it to the story you just heard. If Zeus is her father, then the Zeus-Nemesis pursuit turns into an incest story by accident, not because ancient sources were trying to tell that version, but because someone forced two separate strands into one rigid family tree. That contradiction is the tell. When you see it, it usually means the mythology has been treated like a single official canon that must be made consistent, even if the only way to fix it is to break it. Ancient myth doesn't work like that, because parallel strands exist at the same time. Different regions tell different versions, and later writers preserve different lines. Modern lore hates that mess, so it tries to iron it flat. So this is the development into the present in one sentence. Nemesis shifts from a specific corrective force in older tradition into a modern symbol for payback. And the more the culture demands quick icons and clean charts, the more she gets blended, simplified, and occasionally rewritten into contradictions that never needed to exist in the first place. So now you can see the danger. Nemesis gets turned into a clean symbol, and the sharp parts get edited out. One last thing before you go. Normally I wouldn't ask this, but if you want to help the channel out and you want more stories like this, please like and subscribe. And leave a comment. It helps more than you think. Also, if you liked this video, check out the other videos on the end screen showing up now. I'll see you in the next story. Thanks for watching.